Living in Bell Gardens in the early 90s, I remember hearing stories about gangs from yesteryear that used to roam the city. Being that Bell Gardens is a predominantly Hispanic city nowadays, the two gangs that stood out the most to me were the Ford Park Posse and the Bell Gardens White Boys. Yes, there were actually white people in Bell Gardens at one time, folks. I decided to go down a rabbit hole and dig up as much info as I could about these gangs and other gangs that used to hang in the city of Bell Gardens. I'm also looking to interview anyone who was part of the Bell Gardens White Boys or the Ford Park Posse. So if that is you, please DM me on Instagram at dustyvisiontv or dustyvisiontv on Facebook. And before I get started, I want to thank the Facebook groups Memories of Bell Gardens and You Know You Grew Up in Bell Gardens When for assisting me in my research. And please post below in the comment section, what do you remember about growing up in the city of Bell Gardens? It wasn't all bad. Richard says, played basketball almost every night at John Anson Ford Park. Yeah, Richard, when I was coming up in the early 90s, gang activity was at an all-time high in LA County, so we hardly ever played at the park past sundown. I do remember, though, the generation before me telling me that they used to play basketball, football, and even fish at the lake all hours of the night. Sadly, you can't really do that anywhere in LA County anymore. Steve says, I was one of the founding members of the Bell Gardens White Boys back in the day. Steve, I would love to speak with you. Please, please, please check your DM or DM me on dustyvisiontv, Instagram, or Facebook. Ruben Calderon says, we used to pop and breakdance at Ford Park back in the early 80s. Free lunches and swimming. Oh, man, I remember free lunches. Good times. You're taking me back, Ruben. Ford Park was one of my favorite parks to go swimming at on a hot, sunny day. I think it costed like $0.25 back when I was a kid. Me and a couple of my buddies would ride the city tram from one part of the town to the other. And one of my favorite memories was after swimming, we would go to the burger stand that was right down the street. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but they had the best fries. Big old bag of fries for only like $1. Good times, good times. Stephen Wyatt, speaking of Ford Park Posse, back in the day, we had the Bell Gardens Locos, Brown Neighborhood, 18th Street, BG White Boys, Playboys. That was back in the 70s, so they must have started later than that. Yeah, Stephen, very little info is online about Ford Park Posse, so I don't know when they were established and when they became defunct. But hopefully I can get those questions answered. Benny the Butcher, says, don't forget King Kobras. Oh, yeah, I remember seeing King Kobras hit up everywhere back in the day. Jamie says Ford Park Posse was around in the late 80s, early 90s. Yeah, Jamie, that was definitely the time I lived in Bell Gardens. And definitely hoping to get more information for you guys. Manuel says they would hang out by the bridge on the riverbed. That bridge is not there anymore. I think I think that's Foster Bridge, right? I think you are true. I remember hearing about that as a kid as well. Armando says King Kobras, Bell Gardens Locos, Brown Neighborhood, BG White Boys, Playboys. Ford Park Posse came later. WES, Clara Street Locos, etc. I remember WES and Clara Street. For sure. We didn't go down Clara Street, man. I was from the other side of Bell Gardens, over there by Lubeck. Julia says, I've seen some of their graffiti, but never encountered them that I'm aware of. Richie Mendez says, Junior Mafia. Yep, I remember Junior Mafia. I even remember when the rap group Junior Mafia came out, and I was like, oh, that's kind of weird because we have a Junior Mafia gang right here in Bell Gardens. Hearing Biggie Smalls talk about Junior Mafia, but, you know, it all makes sense now. Michael says the Trevino brothers were part of them and Mike D. Michael, if you could tell me more about the Trevino brothers and Mike D, I'd really appreciate it, my man. Juan says Ford Park Posse was a party crew at first. They hanged out on Scout in Bell Gardens. One of my homies that actually did time for shooting Bleedy, one of their OGs. No bullshit. They were deep mofos, though. Okay. Thank you for that information, Juan. And if you have any more, please reach out. Michael Alcala says, I remember these two guys being from Fort Park Posse, Locos, Beaver and Red. I remember them. They got into Bell Gardens Locos over the years back in the early 90s. Chris Wayne says, I lived across the street from Fort Park for some years until my teens. I hung out at Fort Park almost every day. I kicked it with UEC Tagging Crew and NTS 13. I remember NTS. I remember when NTS didn't even have the 13 on the end. Notorious Tagging Crew back in the day. Wow. And I tried not to get too involved. Guess I never ran into Fort Park Posse. I did hear about them, though. This was like late 80s, early 90s when shit was real bad. I ran into a lot of different gangs in Bell Gardens because I also lived on Florence Place. Shit, Bell Gardens was like a war zone back then. It's so crazy how some people don't know about that life. Growing up in it, I just thought it was a part of normal life until I moved. I've seen some crazy shit in all them years. Lots of shit. People getting jacked, jumped for being in the wrong hood, shootings, and everyday norms. I seen one guy, get jumped, and he was stomped out by 5 people. Didn't nobody do anything. I was only like 10 years old. Most of my family still lives there. So many memories, good and bad. I lived through it. I'm 39 now. Damn, Chris, thank you for sharing that, man. Yeah, it looks like you and I grew up in Bell Gardens pretty much around the same time, or lived there at least around the same time. And yeah, like you said, those times were crazy. I mean, LA County is not nearly as bad as it was back in the the late 80s, early 90s. But sadly, it seems like we're going back to those days.
Just give me a little bit of peace, steady job and some food to eat. Just give me a little bit of peace, steady job and some food to eat. Just give me a little bit of peace.
Richard once again says it was never a gang at all. It was more like a crew that hung out. Okay, thanks, Richard. I do believe that the Bell Gardens Police Department labeled them a gang, though, right? I feel like I saw that somewhere. I could be wrong, but either way, I appreciate your comment. David says the 1962 issue of Time magazine that reported on the 1960 census characterized Bell Gardens as a low-class, stagnant community along with Newark, New Jersey. Damn, we were in the same category as Newark, New Jersey at one time. David continues, as I worked at Ball Drugstore stocking those 1962 magazines, the idea of doing better was born in me and never left. Wow, so you thought you could do better because the Time magazine basically labeled Bell Gardens a shithole. That's pretty crappy. Wow. Alma says, I lived in Gotham Street in the late 80s. I used to call it the zombie block. A lot of addicts high on PCP. Yes, PCP seemed to be a big drug of choice back then. I haven't smelled it in over 20 plus years, but I could still remember the horrible stench of PCP, aka water, aka Gorilla P. It was definitely Night of the Living Dead back in the 1980s, for sure. Debbie says, okay, I think they got together in the 1970s. Mark Martin, Jeff Martin, Billy Scott, Jimmy, Rusty, Dale Mafoose. That's just some of them. Oh, yeah. Thank you, Debbie. And if you could put me in touch with any of those people, I would truly appreciate it. Linda says, me, Donna, and Tina tried to do a Bee Gees White Girl. LOL. Didn't work out well. Total fail. Wow, I'd love to hear more about that. The Bee Gees White Girls. Look, Bell Gardens had, to this day, when I was a kid, I just remember them having some of the flyest women, man. Bell Gardens had some of the prettiest girls. That's where I fell in love with Latinas. That's where I was just like, man. Because before that, I didn't really, it was really just kind of like black and Asian in my neighborhood. I was in Long Beach and didn't see too many sexy ass Latinas, but damn, Bell Gardens changed all that. Joe says it did start in the 1970s. Who remembers Shannon Hatley? I went to BGI with Shannon, Mark, and Greg, also a member from the White Boys, started another gang in BG. Thank you, Joe. I feel like I'm getting closer and closer to getting answers. Mitchell says, I remember a big fight on Habaneria in Eastern gas station, late 70s. Bell Gardens, White Boys, and King Kobras, I think. Damn, okay. Getting a little juicy. Now we're starting to get somewhere. Robert says, yes, it was the Kobras. That was behind Quickway in the alley. Edgar says, who remembers the Marlowe Park Stoners? Doesn't ring a bell to me, Edgar, but I am going to look more into that. Jeff says, I remember as early as approximately the early 70s seeing Bell Gardens White Boys graffiti tagged on a wall at Eastern and Habaneria. And a few years later, talk of fights between the Bell Gardens White Boys and the King Kobras. Thank you, Jeff. Jeff also says there was a story about a teenage boy hanging from a tree at Bell Gardens Park. I think that was a white boy, and it may have been gang related. I, too, remember hearing that story growing up. Sarah says, I remember a man named Bam Bam from BG White Boys. He was friends with my mom in the late 80s, early 90s. Yeah, this is when I just heard the name heavy, like a lot, don't hang out in Fort Park, past sunset or whatever, sundown, because the Fort Park posse was deep. It was just something that would travel through the city. And the Bell Gardens White Boys, I didn't ever hear anything about them, being in my town in the 80s and 90s. I would always remember hearing about them, yesteryear, from older stories from the 70s and early 80s before I even set foot into Bell Gardens. Kelly says, I played softball at Bell Gardens Park in 71, I think, and one day during practice, 4 men from my family showed up to take me home. They were all 6 feet to 6'6". They went to the coach and let him know there was going to be a fight between the White Boys and the Locos. Practice ended and the coach took the other girls home. Damn, shit was popping back then, huh? Okay. 1971. All right, early 70s we're talking. All right, BG White Boys came to my rescue at my dad's house week of the fair at Bell Gardens Park. We had trouble with neighbors, about 20 of them. They showed up and took care of business. Their cars were destroyed, beat up, a massive riot. It was wild. Cops came, took several of my neighbors to jail. They never bothered my dad's house again. Larry Moreno, Victor Gomez, Ray Nunez, myself were partying, and they decided they wanted to fight. It was 20 against 5 of us. That's when the BG White Boys came to our rescue. Damn, thanks for sharing that, Christopher. Dennis says, I was there, Christopher, when you came to the fair and said you needed help. We all loaded into cars and followed you to your house. And as soon as we got there, it got crazy. Fights going on everywhere. I remember chasing this one Mexican, and as he ran in the house, I kicked the screen door shut, which made him fall back, and I just drilled him to the ground, then jumped in the car and started smashing the windshield out. Jumped on the car and started smashing the windshield out, and effing crazy, but we all had our adrenaline pumping, and the reason we were all at the fair was because the Mexicans put the word out that there better not be any white boys at the fair or they were going to get their asses whipped. So every white boy in town showed up at the fair, and they decided they didn't want none after all. Damn, what a story. Richard says, I remember those days, us against the Cholos. So glad we made it out alive. Those were some crazy times. David said, don't know when, but why they formed should be obvious. The same reason we started the BGWL. I don't know what that is. Seen Bell Gardens White Boys versus Kobras football game at the Fort Park around 77 to 78. Esa called Nano. An Esa called Nano, took a hard shot and didn't like it, and the place exploded. The Bell Gardens White Boys were outnumbered 3-1, and they had to fight their way out. We jumped back in the van and smoked the tires, getting out before the bullets started flying. Lester says, I remember the Bell Gardens White Boys while in high school. The leader for a time was Johnny Lee Clary, who later became Johnny Angel, the wrestler, and further down the track became a grand wizard of the KKK and then a traveling preacher. Damn. Wow, I feel like we got somewhere on this during my little research project about the Ford Park Posse and the Bell Gardens White Boys. I will continue this series. I will continue to try to find someone who is part of either of these gangs or crews or whatever they call themselves. So please do stay tuned, and please hit the subscribe button on YouTube, Dusty Vision TV. Follow me on Facebook, Dusty Vision TV. Follow me on Instagram, Dusty Vision TV. I love you, Bell Gardens.